welcome to today's webinar, Healing from Historical Trauma, Self-Determination. My name is BC Echohawk. On behalf of the Native Connections team and Contracting Officer Representatives Maureen Madison and John Dunbar Cooper, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. We are recording today's webinar and all phone lines will be muted. Please don't hesitate to use the chat box for questions throughout the session. First, opening us up in a good way today is TTA Coordinator Leon Leadercharge. Leon?
Oh, Beto Washday, thank you for joining us today. And we'll start the good presentation and good information with the Wucheki Aloha. So join with me in thought and prayer as we start the opening in a good way. Thank you.
Thank you, Leon, for that beautiful opening. Thank you for your song. Sogole Sagwe, Kajijalolux Neongets, Atnawa, Niwa Gitalot, Oniota Aga, Niwa Hanjot. So my name is Marie Schuyler Drever, everyone. I am a Native Connections Grantee Technical Assistant, GTA. Welcome, everyone.
And leader charge of Masalafina, Congo, Lala, Lakotana. My name is Leon Leader Charge. I'm part of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe and the Oglala Sioux Tribe, and I reside in the Cut Meat Creek community here on the Rosebud Sioux Tribe Reservation. And I am a SAMHSA Tribal Training Technical Assistance Coordinator.
Today we have joining us in this webinar of our Part 3 series of the Healing from Historical Trauma. We have Regis Picos from the Cochiti Pueblo. He is the co-founder of the Leadership Institute at the Santa Fe Indian School.
And also we had a pleasure and honor of having Tui Auntie Ethline Ironclad Two Dogs. She's Oglala Lakota subject matter expert in cultural healing interventions. And Tui Auntie Dr. Chase, Josie Chase, Mandan Hidatsa, Director of Horse Nation Healing Incorporated.
We also have with us today here is Robert Brown. He is from the Oneida Nation, and he is a traditional language. He doesn't like to be called an expert, but here we do call him an expert as a subject matter. So welcome.
And also Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, Hunkpapa Oglala Lakota, Director of Native American and Disparities Research, University of New Mexico.
Our objectives have not really changed since this is our third part of the webinar series, as I had mentioned. We've covered what we would like to call the past, present, and today we are looking towards the future. The objectives today continue to be where we are cultivating awareness on the impacts of historical trauma on our American Indian, Alaska Native populations. We introduce a common language and understanding wherein we can speak, educate, and share our experiences with historical trauma in our American Indian and Alaska Native nations and communities. Share efforts in healing from historical trauma and unresolved grief in American Indian and Alaska Native populations, and provide examples of resilience and how we create action for healing from historical trauma. And now we'd like to partake in a brief overview of the chat activity here. And this is where we're looking at the questions, and we're asking you participants that have joined us here today. I know that BC has wrote in the chat box if you'd like to introduce yourselves through chat by listing your name and your program name and what community you're coming to us from today. And in the chat, we would like for your responses to be from these questions here. Do you believe there is a direct correlation between historical trauma and the current trauma we see in our community, our family, or ourselves? Again, do you believe there is a direct correlation between historical trauma and the current trauma we see in our communities, our families, or ourselves? And what culturally related practices in your community do you feel increase resilience in your youth? Perhaps it's something that you've done in your community where you've noticed perhaps a rebirth. I know during COVID, and when we were all in lockdown and quarantined at home, a lot of communities opened they were hosting language programs already in the community in person, but they resulted to going to virtual. And a lot of our activities were then being hosted in the same manner, but virtually. And so looking at that, has that had any increase in perhaps the resilience that you see in your youth? Oh, we do have some activity here. And then it says, let's see here. Oh, sorry, there's writing and I'm trying to scroll. It says, good morning, afternoon. My name is Gordon Aya, prevention specialist with Native Connections in Nome, Alaska. Welcome, Gordon. And then BC's, welcome to Gordon. Thank you, BC. Tehantahawi, did I say that right? Welcome, she's joining us from Akwesasne. And we have, there she is, the Native Connections Grant Coordinator from the St. Regis Mohawk in Akwesasne. And BC says, yes, I know there is a correlation. Melanie Stevens, she's from Oakville, Washington. We also have Takmiya from Nimpu Nation. My name is Abram, and I am the Nez Perce Tribe Students for Success Director from Lapwai, Idaho. Almost, okay. And then good afternoon, Bo Medicine Crow. Welcome, Bo. This is one of my grantees, Native Connections Project Director for the Mandan Hidatsa Rikra Nation out in North Dakota. And then Gordon answers the chat activity question with, I believe so, yes. Trauma, unfortunately, has been one of the things passed through the generations. Hello, everyone. I am Bob Kozna from the Nome, Alaska, and I am the Youth Initiative Specialist. Dehun Dahawi. Dahawi. I could get the last part. It was the middle part. Great. Thank you for your responses, everyone. Well, we have some more coming in. We have another one of my grantees from Santa Barbara, California, Simone. Yes, I believe there is a direct correlation between the two. We can see it in our families, community, education system, and even in ourselves. The chains of psychological trauma is rattling, and luckily there are culturally related practices to begin acknowledging the trauma. Yes, there is a correlation, and the practice that we have found to increase resilience are our outdoor youth prevention activities. And that comes from Abram from the Nez Perce people. So yes, we're seeing it in our outdoor, especially at this time of year. We have many communities that are sharing in their sustainability as far as rebirth of our gardening, our planting. I do understand that a lot of communities are partaking in that and having their youth participate. In the Pawnee community, our language is taught in the public school system. Wow, yes, we're seeing that as well. in many communities where they've had communication with their school systems, their local public school systems, in introducing the language in the classroom. Well, thank you everyone for your participation in the chat. And let's go on to the next here. So here we're looking at the historical trauma and unresolved grief. And now we will be handing this over to Regis. But first, I'd briefly like to give you an understanding of our historical trauma. The overview is what we're going to be covering today, is going to be on what we're looking towards as far as the resiliency factors, the self-determination. In the other parts of our series that we covered the historical trauma already and some of the results of what that looks like. And now we're looking forward to the resiliency part. So I will now like to pass this over to Regis. And thank you again, Regis, for joining us live today for discussing these thoughts today within Indian country.
Thank you, Marie. Goatsi hopa, shatsayat, shakoyat, sewat yumit, hati zikuta, seum ku, hu and se hok ashimi mani gotsti on the tuna you eat a chase, 8 shawan you ouch go, mani hati zi, uat mastan hati zikuta. Foremost, I want to say thank you and give appreciation and gratitude to the prayers answered that we have an opportunity from throughout the country to have the opportunity to engage in dialogue, to share and learn together. And I offered that appreciation in my first language of Keres, of the Cochiti people where I was born and raised. And just very quickly, I'm the former governor of Cochiti Pueblo, having served multiple terms and served on the tribal council for about 35 years. I also served for 16 years in the executive in the state of New Mexico, as the director of the State Office of Indian Affairs, now a cabinet department, and 26 years in the legislature, the majority of that time as the chief of staff to the Speaker of the House, the longest serving Speaker of the House in New Mexico. And more recently, now in our 25th year, co-founded the Leadership Institute based on the campus of the Santa Fe Indian School. That is an indigenous think tank that convenes indigenous peoples in New Mexico to talk about the challenges that we face today. And what you see before you all today is really the paradigm that we use to provide context in where we have been and where we are and how it is that we move forward. And in all of our societies, in our cultures throughout Indian country, we all know the stories shared by word of mouth by our elders over time, our ancestors. And always there is this beginning. It is of origin. And in Pueblo community and Pueblo way of life, that is the center of my presentation today, it is a time that our elders teach us was the time of emergence, coming from the spiritual world into this physical world. And we are taught that at that time of emergence, that the Creator gifted to us all that would be necessary for the maintenance of a healthy mind, body, and spirit along our journey that we continue today, as many before us have done so in their time. And so one of the first gifts is coming from that spiritual world into this physical world is the gift of connection to our Mother Earth, land as that is represented in this circle. And of course, language as the precious gift that allows us, one, to find meaning and purpose in our lives, and the gift of the way of life that our elders remind us is not something we practice 1 hour out of the day or 1 day out of the week, but is a conscious life that we are engaged in, as that defines our way of life. And of course, the gift of laws and customs, that one is the process and the means of the maintenance of balance between all living things, important in the health of these relationships. And governance as a gift, as a process, one that also contributes to the maintenance of relationship among human beings, among all living things. And of course, family as the ultimate receiver of the most precious gift from our Creator that humanity can continue, and that is the gift of the sacred spirit of the child into this world, that the parents are the people who receive this gift. But it also speaks to the way in which community is an integral part in this relationship, because none of us know what gift a child brings into this world, while rather they are bringing into this world the gift of an intellect, of great intelligence, or whether they bring with them the gift of vision. As we all know in our life, people that we have been blessed who can see beyond the horizon, or the gift of the ability to listen, or the gift of the ability to speak and communicate and articulate the things that are part of the relationships among our people. Or whether we have the gift of healing and creation, or whether we carry the gift of incredible deep love and compassion for others. And because none of those we know what a child brings into this world, that the gift of community becomes an important part that obligates to the parents that we are all part of nurturing the mind and the heart of children to define what kind of caretakers they ultimately become as part of our community, that in time they become our caretakers. And of course, natural resources, all that grows, that flies, that swim, that walk upon our Mother Earth, and water being the most symbolic in this gift and circle of the gifts of the Creator, as water is symbolically the giver of all life. So important in this connection and paradigm is this next circle of core values. And our elders teach us that core values is an essential part of a conscious life and conscious living. And the question that we always ask in all of our convenings, and I ask all of you to think deeply about this question: what is a core value that defines who you are? And what is a core value that defines why you do what you do? And then answer in this next question: who gifted you this core value that defines who you are, that guides your life, that defines why you do what you do in your life? And it's often going to be the people that you acknowledge is either going to be mom or dad or grandpa or grandma, or some significant person in the extended family. And people will share that the core value that defines who I am is love or respect, or it's compassion for others, or it's faith, or it's understanding, or it's the spirituality that I have that allows me to relate to people the way that I do, or it's the ability to find balance, or having empathy, or dignity, or integrity. All of these things become an important acknowledgement as the most precious gift to us by those that express the deepest kind of love, as our elders teach us, because those who gifted us this core value know that in our lives, long after our parents, our grandparents return to our Creator, that it will be this precious core value gifted to us that will guide our lives, that will define who we become, that will define what we do in our lives, that will define why we do what we do in our lives. And these become important elements. These are deeply embedded emotional elements in who we become as human beings. And they are what give life to the gifts of the Creator. And that is what really strikes the emotion, strikes the nerve when the gifts of the Creator are threatened, and why we respond emotionally, why we respond with deep compassion or passion to do the things that we do to sustain the gifts of the Creator given to us along with our original instructions of how to live and how to be, what contributes to the maintenance of a healthy mind, body, and spirit. And the third circle is the gift that really is seasonal in our worldview, that we move from one season as we may move from winter to spring, when new life emerges, when we prepare the planting of seeds, and through summer nurture so that by the fall we are able to harvest the seeds that replenish, that provide for our sustenance. But it is a cyclical process, reminding us that the center of this cycle of life is the gift of faith and spirituality that guides our life, that is brought to life with the core values that ties us to the gifts of the Creator as indigenous peoples in this gift of a worldview by our Creator. But it was also prophetically part of the teaching of the elders that in our life journey, there will be others who would enter our path in our lived experiences or along our journey. And if we move to the next slide, to appreciate that over time, from the time of first contact through colonization, as our elders prophesied, others will come upon our path, and others will threaten the gifts of the core, the gifts of the Creator. And we would respond driven by the deeply embedded core values gifted to us, to be the stewards, to be the guardians, to sustain our worldview and way of life. And so it is, our elders also teach us that the greatest expression of our love for the gifts of the Creator is how we respond to these challenges, to protect, to guard, to be stewards of these gifts that define who we are as indigenous people. It is at the heart indigenous sustainability. But as was prophesied by our elders, this frame here depicts how government purposefully defined policies and laws that we call impositions over time that attempted to disconnect us from our lands. And as the first Indian education policy was unveiled, that the mantra in 1890 with boarding schools was built upon the mantra that the way you kill language and the way you kill culture is to remove children from their language and culture and deny them their language and culture. And so there was very intentional ways that policies were created, that this mantra attempted to kill our language, that over time in the late 1880s and 90s, laws were conceived and laws were implemented that prohibited the practice to make our indigenous way of life of that was defined to be a crime to practice with the religious crimes code that prohibited our engagement. So through all of these impositions of policies and laws, it was about genocide and extermination and assimilation and the kind of transformation of our own customary laws our own governance system to be forced into an electoral process of creating the politicization of how people become leaders that resulted in fragmentation over time to dismantle community, or the relocation policies and laws that broke up families, that dismantled community. All of these policies and laws over 100 years, as we use this timeline, is all about the way in which these impositions caused disruption that resulted in what we now know to be defined as intergenerational trauma, manifesting in poverty, manifesting in low academic achievement, manifesting in hunger, manifesting in health disparities, manifesting in cycles of self-destruction. So the question asked at the forefront, does intergenerational trauma have anything to do with the past treatment and the creation of policies and laws that really created the kind of impositions? The obvious answer we know now is yes, because this was a very intentional part of the most powerful nation in this world. And as we look to the more recent efforts, as we look at education, as we look at housing, as we look at economic development, these are all re-image policies and laws that continue to impose upon us, that continue to cause dysfunction. And of course, that kind of intergenerational imposition creates a magnitude of disruption to the maintenance of a healthy mind, body, and spirit, as was gifted to us by the Creator. And when we ask the questions, what are we doing today? Are the things that we're doing today strengthening our connection to our core values? Or are the decisions that we're making today and the actions that we are engaged in taking us further away from the core values? And if we're moving further away from our core values, our elders teach us that that's when we deteriorate from within, that when we see the kind of chaos, the violence in our communities, it is a result that we are losing the core values that has otherwise sustained us over the worst of times since colonization, through the wars, through genocide, through extermination, through assimilation. And so now it brings us to the present, if we move to the next slide, to really begin asking ourselves, how do we get beyond all of these elements, all of these factors that over generations have created for the kind of reflections that are articulated and delineated in this slide, that has everything to do with the manifestation of how our lives have been impacted as a result of the deliberate nature, the purposeful conceptualization of policies and laws to eradicate us, to exterminate us, but we continue in our survival as a result of the adherence of every generation before us who have sacrificed their lives. And as we come to this place today in the present, we must understand that the challenges we face today are deeply embedded in that history. And as we ask the question, what do we want future generations to inherit from us? What we do today is already defining an answer to that question. What kind of caretakers do we want our children to become? We are already answering that question by the things that we do or the things that we fail to do as our ancestors teach us, so that the life lessons of our history, of all the sacrifices, of all that we have been subjected to, if those aren't the heart lessons that we must learn to define how we respond differently in this time, the question for future generations will be, how did my ancestors respond in this time? And so there is an awesome responsibility that we have if we move to the next slide, which will be the beginnings of the discussions about how all of what is represented here that are the manifestation of what we've been subjected to that has resulted in intergenerational trauma that results in disconnect in healthcare inequity, with elders passing, with language loss, and all of the things that create for the injustices and inequities that we face. So it is an awesome responsibility, but what we have inherited, we started off with language, with prayer and song to give us the affirmation that many people sacrifice to define what we have inherited. So the question we ask today is, what do we want all future generations to inherit from us? And as we move to the next slide, we begin the discussion of how we heal and what is it that we do to heal so that we return to the original instructions of how to live and how to be, and what we do to contribute for the maintenance of a healthy mind, body, and spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Regis. Thank you. Thank you so much for those words. Next, we're going to move into a clip that we have from the many meetings that we all shared with each other. And it's a clip that we have from Mr. Robert Brown. And I just want to say, he's not just our Oneida language expert, or as we say, knowledge keeper. He is also our Bear Clan chief in our Haudenosaunee Longhouse, in our Oneida Longhouse. So thank you. I'll send it on over so we can listen to this piece.
So there's a lot of things. So their understanding is, the ones who are clear-minded in a sense, is they bring back that family fire and they rekindle their fire so that their fire can burn bright again as it once did before. Even though that one part of them has diminished, but they still have to carry on, because again, we always have to look to those faces that we say that are coming yet to be born here upon this earth. And we say that their faces are within the earth yet, that they're waiting to be born. And so it's sort of like it's a continuation.
And this question I'm posing to Robert here. Every generation has responded to challenges. In these times of self-determination, what are we doing differently from those we once criticized? This is a question I'm posing to you, Robert. And then another to follow is, if we are working within Western frameworks, are we truly strengthening our cultures?
Annalise ne jungiat sen wewe ne wagescle wake ni wakita loda ne oni son ne oni da aga ne ni kahonchod ne dos ne hapeko ne chinate ne yuquatli wate chotkot qui ne lundu hakwe in wasot sla gone ne ganyo ona kauk ne ona neni yetiat katose qui wachoknu kahwichilayandu ne yudohoncho ne tuno dat katsoknu ondwete aga gweni gui hayetian dektose ne hakwego ne lulu ha nuwa ne ona nentuno ne na huntkunda kwe ne ni waksada ne dos gui segu gui yuli padajes tunu nan yuli wage. So this the things that we do is, as I recall, you know, when I was little, these were some of the things in regards to the self-determination that each and every one of us will have in a point of our lives. And this particular question sort of comes back to me in that sense of when I was little. And when I was little, that there was a time during our ceremonies in that time where I always wondered about our elders at the time. And there's one particular part in our ceremony where someone is chosen to give encouraging words, encouragement to all of us that are gathered during this time of the year. And this was during our midwinter ceremonies. And so during that time, they would get this one particular elder. And it seemed like always that the times that I was there, before he passed, but anyway, he would be the one who would express these words. And he always gave encouragement, especially to the families. And he would always say that he would always encourage that they bring their children to the ceremonies, to make them to be a part of everything that goes on. And the reason why he would say that is, he said, because that there's going to come a time that they are the ones who are going to follow through and continue these things on as well. And so he would say that as you're sitting here following and seeing everything taking place, he would say there's either a boy or a girl that is sitting there and she's listening or he's listening to all of these words. And at some point in time that we as elders, he would say, that we're not going to be here much longer. Those of us who are older at this time. And what's going to happen is they're going to notice that, they're going to see that. And then what happens is then it comes to their mind that this is for them now to carry on, that they now have to carry on all of these things as best as they can. So it's very important to the parents that they always make sure that their children are always a part of all of the ceremonies that take place. And because they are the ones now that are going to follow through and continue those things. And so to me, that's the things that we do. And that was, a number of years ago that I sat there and listened to this old man, and he would express that. And so after a while during my teen years, I started really listening to that and understanding it a little bit more, because from that moment in time, from when I was a little kid to my teen years, then I began to notice, then a lot of our elders began to pass on and going back to the Creator. And so from that, then I began to notice that those of us who were there, it was now our I guess I would say, I wouldn't say chance, but it was our time to begin to follow through with all of the things that they were instructed to. And it was my understanding that perhaps this elder man, he at one time heard those very same things, those expressions of that. And so he began to relay that same thing. And so now, as it is, I am now also doing those same things as well today in our communities. And so these are the very things that we look to. And that is what I look to being as these times of our self-determination, is that we have to really listen and pay attention to what's going on around us. And one of the things too that we look at is we had, growing up, we had a lot of elders. And at that time, everyone had a place, or say they had a purpose that they were doing. And so as we look at it today, there isn't really that many that we could say could go through the various things that we do throughout the ceremonies. Even though we work together, we network together. There are those who do the speaking, and there are those who do the songs and the dances. You know, they're all a part of everything. And so these are all of the connections that we have. And so the things that we do is what we carry on forward, you know, because now, as we said, that we are looking forward to the next generations that are coming. And so we have to be able to, you know, continue those things that that we are doing today for their benefit, for their behalf, on their behalf. And so we're trying to do the best that we can. And so in the in regards to the second phase of this question, if we are working within Western frameworks, are we truly strengthening our cultures? And I think I do believe that we are, because as it is, we try to utilize the various things that we are given, and the things that we are given are what we call our tools. And these tools that we utilize, we try to, you know, use them in that manner that will be helpful for those generations that are yet to come. And we're strengthening them with our culture, understanding, and the language. You know, we strengthen that with our language, and all of these things, you know, that our ancestors were not accustomed to necessarily. But as it is, we were working within those frameworks to put all of those together to help strengthen our people, so that they too will have the opportunity and be able to follow all of these instructions that they have been given. And so when we talk about our instructions, we say that before we even step foot upon this earth, and Regis had mention to a part of that as well, that we are given these instructions. And so it's all of these things that we are given a path. Ne wasagwa tahunya se ne sagwaya diso. Jinyole and wasquas lach with gone to Juhunja de Jot ne agwego and with yalake jignachte sagwawi sagwaya diso and wadli what the jake dohage ne Juhunja de. So it is that before we step foot upon this earth, we say that we are already given instructions of the things that we're going to do. And we have a path that has been designated for each and every one of us, and it's up to us to, you know, follow through with that path that we are on as best as we can. And so these are the things that, you know, you come together to help strengthen each and every one's path, especially when they're small children. At the time we give them that instruction, we give them that understanding that this is the path that they are on. And so, and that we have to be able to be there to guide them along as best as we can. And so these are the things that we work towards, you know, and every one of us, you know, have that opportunity to do that for ourselves and for each other as people. Yonko.
Yonko, Robert, for answering those and for what your words that you shared with us all. I'm going to now ask these same questions to Regis, if you would please share.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you to Elder Robert for the beautiful and eloquent articulation to enlighten us. You know, that the frame that I previously showed with all of the imposition of federal policies and laws that were purposefully conceived to destroy our indigenous systems and institutions really is a major part of the devastation of our history and was really at the center in the creation of a new policy and a new law that was introduced in the early mid-70s as a shift to the previous decades of termination and relocation as another effort, one, to dismantle our indigenous communities. And so self-determination really was a major breakthrough in our historical timeline that was to return to indigenous people and their communities and their governments the opportunity to retake control, to reclaim all that the government over the last 100 years had attempted to destroy. And so one of the very important questions that we ask in our Leadership Institute convenings is this very question. In these times of self-determination, what are we doing differently from those times when others were in control we were critical of? It is a very profoundly important question, because I think all of us will attest by our experience that the first 20 or 30 years of self-determination as a new policy and law that resulted in unprecedented resources to our communities, that all we really did was to replace brown faces where there were once white faces that we were critical of what they were doing to continue to push us towards assimilation. And so Head Start becomes a very classic example. We embraced Head Start in the late 60s and early 70s. But what we failed to ask is, where was Head Start a Head Start to? If not, an earlier effort to become fluent in English. And the question that we failed to ask is, at what expense? And the answer to that question, obviously, is that it was at the expense of our own indigenous languages in our own communities, taught by our own people, embraced by our tribal councils, which is not a criticism, but it is a reality that what we were once critical of that began in 1890 with boarding schools and taking children away from families, away from communities, and denying those children their language as a way to kill their culture. Now, Head Start becomes something in our own communities, re-imaged in a new policy that created opportunity, but in the face of that opportunity, it was no different than what happened and that began in 1890. So in self-determination, this becomes a really important question. Are the decisions we're making consistent with strengthening our core values, or the decisions that we are making by embracing programs without critical analysis and thinking, contributing to moving us further away from the core values? So at the time that our systems and institutions that have been at the heart of our cultural survival over the last several hundred years, we can find ourselves simply replicating programs without critical analysis, and then we are contributing potentially to our own demise. And so critical in all of this kind of considerations, if we are truly going to break into a period of returning to become self-determined, then it also is important to articulate a vision of what we want our communities to be like. What is the most desirable community where we want to raise our children? And most often when we ask our people that question, they're going to say a community where language and culture is rich, a community where children and elders are loved and revered and respected, a place where I want to be a part of, where there is a balance to preserving the environment while we're engaged in economic development, where we are striking, as our elder Robert said, seeking balance in all that we do. Because in these unprecedented opportunities, in this time of self-determination, we are either going to redefine programs for implementation for our people in our own communities that, as our elder Robert spoke, strikes a balance. Or our elders also prophesied that when we lose our vision, that we can also contribute to a shift in our communities where those less informed about language and culture and our ways will become the majority, and those who want to remain entrenched, embedded, enriched in language and culture will become a minority. And that creates balance. And sometimes when that imbalance takes place, it is when we find our communities to be in chaos, to really reflect ways in which we become dysfunctional, when we see the manifestation play out with poverty and hunger and health disparities and self-destruction. And so if we are simply replicating Western ways and not, as Elder Robert speaks, of striking a balance, only in this kind of conscious thinking and approaches of how we contribute in indigenous sustainability, whether it's education, to balance education with language and culture embedded, or whether it's new housing projects that doesn't isolate our own people in their own communities, or whether it's one economic development initiatives that one doesn't result in simply replicating those who have and those who don't, or if we're investing in capital intensive labor at the expense of destroying our own remaining homelands. So this question becomes an important and awesome one that we have to be consciously engaged in answering, so that we are contributing to the maintenance of a healthy mind, body, and spirit by creating places that we desire, where we want to raise our children, and then talk about what barriers stand in the way so that we know how to overcome them. So thank you for this question. And thank you again, Elder Robert, for your beautiful articulation of the challenges in this time of self-determination. Thank you, Marie.
Thank you, Regis. Thank you for your words. And thank you, Robert, as well again. We have one comment to the question too in the chat here that I see, and it was from Gordon Aya. It says, as long as it works towards a healthier individual, then yes. So true here. Next slide, please. So now we're looking at culture as prevention. And cultural interventions have proven results as a protective factor for our Native American youth. In addition to your language teaching, what cultural learning and practices have you used to instill resilience? And Regis or Robert, would you like to go first?
Elder Robert, I'll let you go first.
Okay. I think one of the things that come to mind again, as I had said earlier, and growing up with I would say a bounty full of elders that were there, that I could go to and tap into and get various stories and various connections to our teachings. And at that time, it was something that for me, it was very important, to be able to do that, because again, what sort of, entered my mind back at that time was that fact that the elders said, they always kind of seem to come to that conclusion, I guess you would say, that they're not going to be here any longer or that much longer. So it's up to us to, take a hold of these things and follow through with it. And so that was always something that, has been sort of embedded in my mind, in my thoughts constantly. And so those are the things that I do today with our, our youth, our children and grandchildren, too, that they have that availability. And because we were seeing that not only in our community as Oneidas, but also the various other communities of our confederacy. And we had a lot of elders that I had visited throughout time in all of the various nations of our confederacy, and remembering them and listening to the things that they parts of components, things that they had offered, to our peoples. And so today, there really isn't that many necessarily. I guess as we look at it now, we are regarded as the elders now, but sometimes I don't really see that, but I guess we are. And so there were some people that had the ability to recite various things, whether it was through the creation story or whether it was through how we got our ceremonies and how the great law of peace and these other aspects of our people, our prophecies and things like that all came to be. And then so there were key people who had those that knowledge, that ability. And so these were the different ones that I had sat with over the years. And so now that they have passed on, and so it's kind of coming back to for us that we now have to be the ones to continue that on. And so we have been doing that diligently for the last, I would say, 9-10 years of doing that, and trying our best to kind of keep things afloat as best as we can for our future generations. And so these are some of the things that we've been doing, is being able to recite some of these various things that has been told and retold and taught to ourselves. And so now we have the opportunity to also continue that on to our youth, our children, our little ones, and so that they too can have that. And so I guess I look at that as being, that's what our resilience is to be able to continue that on in that way as best as we can. And so it's always been a practice of ours, is what we call, which is our oral traditions, of teaching one another, and through that, and being able to carry that out, in the best way possible for our future generations. Don't go,
Robert. It just reminded me of when you said these words here, that when the Great Law Recital returned, I think it was in 2013, back in Oneida, where I come from, Oneida of the Thames, in Ontario, and how it hadn't been spoken in so long, and sharing our Great Law Recital. And there was something that was said there, and I think you also said it when we did our dry run for this presentation. It's when the peacemaker was sent to our Haudenosaunee people, when he created people, a piece of his mind of his original instructions came with this. So that's a good reminder of that. Like, it's not just our resilience is within our, I guess you could say, our DNA. It's there. So thank you for your words. Before we move over to Regis for this, I had a couple of response in the chat. And so I just want to remind our participants, if you have any words that you'd like to share to these questions that are posed to our panelists, to also you may use the chat box to respond. And Gordon Aya wrote, there are drum making classes available here in Nome, and there are also many camping opportunities hosted by our various organizations in the coming months. And then BC also has reminded, what have attendees used in their communities to instill resilience? And thank you, Gordon, for your comment. So Regis, I'll go ahead and send it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. I think one of the things that is important for all of us to appreciate is that we were once totally oral societies. And now over time and in our history, we are shifting towards a movement away from oral societies for the first time in our journey as Indigenous peoples. And so in that transition, it is necessary for us to think consciously about how we create new contextual settings for the transfer of cultural knowledge, as Elder Robert, underscores. And here's something very symbolic that he shares. If all of us can put ourselves visually when we were children in our communities, and in ceremony we looked and we saw all of the adults and elders that were many in front of us as children at the very end. And as we reflect upon our reality today, think about where you stand similarly. As you look forward, as Elder Robert shares, there are far fewer people ahead of you. But when you look back, there are literally hundreds of people who are walking behind you to recognize the shift of the sacred responsibility of one generation to the next. We are now in a reality where all of our children are now enrolled in public schools. So our children, for a very significant time of their lives, in our communities, in our families, 9 months out of the year, for a significant part of the time, are somewhere else, where in those schools we have very little control in what is taught them. Public school education was designed for monolingual and monocultural societies. There are no considerations for us as a part of that public education design. So what does that tell us? It is what Elder Robert is saying, is that we have to create new places in our own communities to teach our children about language, about culture, about their history, about art and their music, because all of that can only be provided for in the richness of the people who remain in our communities. And those are marginalized no matter what we try to do in the public school setting. So much of the responsibility is how do we rethink, redesign new contextual settings that as we're moving from a total oral society to one that forces us to rethink how to transfer critical cultural knowledge is really within the confines of what we do in our communities, not dictated by anyone, dictated only as we ask ourselves, what is absolutely necessary that we must gift to our children to define what kind of cultural caretakers they will become? Our elders say that if we do our job, there will be many, many generations, as Elder Robert talks about, those that are waiting, one, to make that spiritual journey into this physical world, And as we ask ourselves, what will be their inheritance? Will there be language? Will there be cultural ways? Will there be land upon which they set foot as part of their homeland? Will there be the reflections of the beauty of our people through the art? Will there be song and dance and ceremony? Only we can answer that by what we do in very intentional ways to transfer that cultural knowledge that is essential for indigenous sustainability. When we are able to do that, when we are able to teach our own children what our ancestors overcame, can they really understand what perseverance is? That they can understand and appreciate what resilience is, and teach them what resilience is, to be self-aware, one, to be able to develop the skills that they need to be resilient, because our people and future generations are going to be dependent upon what we give them. And then naturally will come the appreciation for language and culture if they know the history and the sacrifice that has resulted in what they are inheriting from us, to also be steadfast, to commit, to have a love for land and language and culture and history and our people, then that becomes a natural motivation, because that is who they are, to transfer to the next generation as they become our caretakers in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Regis. Thank you for your words. Next slide, please. So here, I'm going to do this a little bit different this time in these questions. We'll ask one question at a time from each of our panelists. And again, those of you that are joining us today, you may enter in the chat. And from that previous one here, we had one of my colleagues that commented in the chat. Barbara Aragon says, I have created digital stories from teachings I have been told and taught, and collaborated with others to develop them. I always include processing questions and have a website I keep them on. These are not my stories, but stories that are significant to me, and I attempt to live the values. So thank you, Barbara. So here now we're shifting over to supporting youth resilience. I will ask, we'll start with Robert, if we could please, if you could answer this first question. How do you introduce the concept of resilience to the youth in your community?
Some of the things that I have utilized is various other people within our nations, or even within our confederacy. And sort of, again, it's like going back to some of those stories that it refers to, and how these names that we have, that we are gifted with, or we are given, that's what we refer to as our identity. And so it's you introduce that, to them, and to know that they are a part of this world, and they're not just just someone that's there, but they're a part of it, and begin to go from there to be able to let them know that whatever gifts that they are given, these are the things that they're going to be able to offer. And then sometimes maybe especially little ones, they don't often know right away what some of those things are, but as they go on, I at times will see, like, maybe a small child, maybe 4 or 5 years old, and by the time they're a teenager, then they come up to me and says, now I know what you mean, what you were telling me when I was little, and so this is now what I'm doing. And so that's some of the things that I help introduce to them, what things that they're going to do. And they have a part of it, rather than being, just there, but they're a part of everything that goes on. And then they begin to have that ownership themselves too. And so I see that as, they've been able to, work through that concept of resilience, with our community and with our youth. And like I said, it's not only our nation necessarily, Oneida, but I work through all the various communities throughout our confederacy. Sometimes I may be amongst the Seneca Nation, or I might be amongst the Mohawk Nation folks, or the Onondagas, and the Cayugas, so I'm sort of like everywhere, and being, having to speak with the kids, that I come in contact with. And most of those kids that I do come in contact with are some of my friends, my elder friends, and young people that I've worked with, over the years. So I've had that, those connections with them. And then they're following through with those things that they had listened to at one time or another. And so this is how I see, that there's that resilience that is there in a lot of our kids, our youth, and continuing that. Don't go.
Yo, Uncle Robert, for your words. Yeah, I'm a product of that. Hey, my grandparents, yeah, they were your my grandmother's still alive, but my grandfather, he's gone, and yeah, you shared with us their grandchildren. So the next Regis, I'd like to ask you, how do you introduce the concept of resilience to the youth in your community? And then also, Regis, if you'd like to also take the second question when you answer the first one, that'd be great. Thank you, Regis.
Thank you, Marie. We do this in a very intentional way by building what we call community-based education programs and experiential learning opportunities, where the community defines what they desire most in this kind of transfer of cultural knowledge. And when we are able to expose young people to this very history that has been part of my efforts to articulate why this history is important as part of appreciating the sacrifice of all those who've gone before, what people are doing today to help to define what we want future generations to inherit from us. It's really using that as the contextual setting for young people to appreciate what incredible ancestors they come from, and the ways in which we are consciously teaching the skills of what it is to be resilient, so that rather than just simply referring to how resilient our people are, it really is in very practical and tangible ways teaching what our ancestors have overcome, the way in which we develop skills about what resilience is, and how it is that we create characters and qualities that reflect resilience in every individual in our communities. So we do this in very intentional ways, using cultural leaders, elders as teachers. And then as we move age appropriately, our Summer Policy Academy, that is now in its 14th year, uses young professionals and established professionals, one, to really exemplify and epitomize what Elder Robert speaks about, the necessity in one striking a balance that we must value the things that define who we are as Indigenous people, to have value of our language and culture and that knowledge. But it also is necessary, one, to learn the Western ways to acquire the skills and tools to strike that balance with which to contribute to the vitality and the vibrancy of our cultures and in our communities. And so we do this in a way so that young people themselves see themselves in what we share with them from those perspectives in those contextual settings, so that they also have an epiphany, recognizing that when they recognize the incredible ways in which our people have persevered, that epitomize the qualities and skills of what resilience is, to be able to see that and embrace it because they appreciate it, because they now have a love for it, that's when young people are engaged in ways that defines the kind of caretakers we want them to be. But it takes time and energy. But if defining what kind of caretakers our children and young people become, no one should have to apologize that it takes that kind of time and energy, if in fact they are the ones who are going to define the most desirable community that we want to be a part of. And so that's how we consciously create opportunities for shared learning, so that young people see the incredible tools and skills that are the pillars of resilience over many generations, inclusive of them. Thank you, Marie.
Thank you, Regis. And Robert, I'll send this question over to you. Do they recognize resilience in themselves and in their families?
Yes, I believe they do. And like you said, you are a product of that. and we have, I know all of the ones who you are close to, all of your friends, those are my former students, and you know that they do. They have that resilience, and they are still continuing. They're doing the same things that that I was doing, at the time. Well, I would say I'm still doing that, necessarily at times with them, but they are now the ones that are carrying those things forward, for our children and the future generations. And so there is that resilience. I see that and it's within their families, and so it's going strong, I would say. And even though there was a bleak moment, I guess I would say, during our times, and that was during the I would say probably around the early 60s, as I recall. There was a lot of our elders, as I said before, that were passing, and it seemed like 2 or 3 within those years, maybe 3 or 4 years, some of them. And so it did become where we had to, it gave us, put our hand to the fire that we needed to, get on the roll here to do the things that they were doing. And so we did, in the best way that we could. But as we begin to do this, it become more and more where that everything that we did was becoming more clear, and sort of like the light was now shining more brightly. It's almost like what I was saying before of rekindling our fire. That's what we did, is rekindle that fire of our culture, our language, and everything, to continue on. And so I do see that resilience, and in a lot of our families, that they are now carrying that as well as we are moving forward. Don't go.
Yo, Robert. And Regis, I'll start with you with this third question. How can educational systems support resilience?
Thank you, Marie. You know, in New Mexico, many of you may know that we litigated a major case beginning in 2014 that resulted in a landmark decision in 2018 known as the Yazzie Martinez decision that challenged the failure of the state to meet its constitutional obligations of our Native children. And this very question is central to that because as I stated before, public education, one, was designed and for the most part remains a model and a system for monolingual and monocultural societies. And we're not part of that. We have a duality. We have dual citizenship or tri-citizenship. So if the Constitution is about preparing young people to be college and workforce and civic ready to participate in their communities, we have a sacred trust as well that we want our children to be college ready, workforce ready, and civic ready to participate in all of the aspects to sustain our sovereign nations. That language and culture is at the heart of that existence. And so this question is absolutely a compelling one and an imperative one that we must think very seriously about. That where we are marginalized in public school systems because we have very little control in the governance of those schools, then we have to think about how we redesign programs in our own communities that we control, that results in our children learning about themselves, about language and culture and their history, their art and their music and their ways of life. So to strike the balance that is absolutely necessary for all of us to continue in our sustainability as Indigenous people into the future, this becomes a central and perhaps the most important question is how do we transfer cultural knowledge? And it necessarily comes with rethinking educational approaches and paradigms, one, to create and strike the balance that Elder Robert has spoken so eloquently about throughout this whole afternoon. So education systems can and must support the resilience of our peoples and young people fully knowledgeable about why they are resilient. It should be at the heart of that vision for education for our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Regis. Robert, I'll ask this same question of you. How can educational systems support resilience?
So the thing about what's happened and which was made aware of from the other episodes of before of the webinar in that historical trauma pieces that were done. And so now in the things that are happening or has happened through the various generations of either our grandparents or great grandparents or even further on. So now that educational systems are now aware of the atrocities that they have inflicted, upon our peoples. I believe, and I've been seeing it myself in the various school systems that we have here in our area, that they're reaching out more and more to our peoples, various peoples, to give them some sort of awareness in their education systems, and they're wanting to support more of the things, and it's sort of like not wanting to repeat that part of our history again, and to be more conscious about what's going on, you know, and how they teach our children. And for many of our communities, Native communities, we have our own school systems. We have our own schools and things where it's the culture and the language is a daily part of our, you know, our lives. But within the outside of our communities where we have children in the urban areas and other places, inner cities, that now some of our children that are there, that that these education systems are reaching out to, wanting to have more understanding of our history, because again, a lot of their history books don't necessarily reflect the true histories of what happened to our peoples. And so again, they're reaching out, you know, and wanting to know more of that, so that they can help, you know, support that as well. And so that's what I've been seeing for the last, I would say, for the last 10, 15 years, you know, in and around. And I've been a part of the education system since the 79, you know, in and around our area here. And so so I've been seeing, you know, the various changes that have been going on, you know, in our area, especially since all of those boarding schools and residential schools issues have been coming up, and more being looked at, and trying to make reason of it, you know, what was the intent, and as was Regis was saying, of how all of these things, you know, and what their policies were, was to phase us out and not make us the way we were designated to be. As I said, you know, we have been given a path here on this earth, you know, and so they deterred us from our path at times. And so, you know, but our path is still there. And it's like yourself and other Regis and Leon and other folks, you know, have been, you know, putting all of this together to bring us, you know, back to that path again for all of our peoples throughout North America on this Turtle Island. Don't go.
Yo, Uncle Robert. Go ahead, next slide, please. And Regis, I'll let you take over on this slide here. Thank you.
So in the time remaining, I just want to point out that over the last 25 years, our Leadership Institute, as an Indigenous think tank, have designed programs at multiple levels, beginning with community-based education, experientially based programs in our respective communities, as well as creating new programs outside of the public school setting, known as summer policy academies, where we use this paradigm to expose young people to learn about the history so that they appreciate all of the elements, characters, qualities, skills that comes with generations of our people, and they're epitomizing their resilience. We have developed this whole framework and network of young professionals and seasoned professionals, along with cultural leaders, to create a huge network of over 10,000 people in the last 25 years built on this paradigm. We've also designed and won, in partnership with Arizona State University, a Pueblo PhD program designed on this paradigm, and in the last 12 years have graduated 12 Pueblo PhDs, the largest of any cohort nationally. And now with litigation in New Mexico, 90% of all Indian children are enrolled in public schools. Only 10% are in tribally controlled schools. So in this litigation, our major breakthrough has been to convince the state that it also has to invest in building programs that are designed by our own pueblos and tribes. So beginning this year will be the first investment by the state to invest nearly 600,000 to each pueblo, each tribe and Navajo Nation nearly $1 million to design their own community-based programs that they control, not the public education department, not the state legislature, but it is really breaking through that the state has to invest resources in programs that are designed by Pueblo and tribal people. So it's really the beginnings of laying a different foundation and framework, but it takes the necessity, sometimes using litigation, to help to convince and invest legislators to appropriate money so that we're not depending on federal grants, because these dollars become permanent sources of revenue, just as public schools receive dollars, not to abandon what has to happen K through 12, but to also invest where Native faculty we're blessed to have in higher education institutions as the third pillar to these efforts. And so it's really with a broad network, but it's something that we have purposefully created over the last 25 years to be in a place where we're now reaping the benefits of shifting that paradigm and redesigning education programs that we're able to control in this time of self-determination. Thank you.
Thank you, Regis, for your words. And next slide, please. I recognize that we are over by just a minute at the moment, but wanted to share with you this word cloud on what we felt was covering today. And it's our restoration, revitalization, intergenerational healing, data sovereignty, environmental activism, reclamation, legislative activism, and deficit narrative, the creativity, disrupt Western model, exercise sovereignty, incorporate culture, and we're thriving. I want to thank everyone today for being here and sharing this time with us. I want to especially thank our panelists, both Robert Brown and Regis Pecos, our colleagues, Leon Leadercharge. Again, thank you for opening us up in a good way today, Mark Taylor and BC. Thank you, everyone.
No, cool.
Mark, let's go ahead to the next slide. Oh, sorry. It looks like we've run out of time for those other chat questions and other questions. We want to thank you for joining us. One more, Mark, I think. We just want to remind you we have some upcoming webinars, Tribal History Acquisition for Healing on June 28th and Sustainability on July 19th. So thank you again for joining us, folks, and we look forward to seeing you the next time. Take care. Bye-bye.